Hey everybody, I want to do something a little bit unusual today for chapel. I want to tell you a story, and I've never told this story to anybody before because in the past I felt like it was just a little bit too soon, too close to the events to share it. But I think enough time has passed now to share the story about my friend Frank. I want to tell it to you because a lot of you are at the age that you're starting to learn to drive. Some of you have already been driving, and if you're not learning to drive, you will be soon. And driving is more dangerous now than it ever has been before. It's not because the roads are not safer. I think they probably are. It's not because the vehicles are less safe. They're safer than ever with airbags and seat belts and all these things. The reason driving is more dangerous is because of all the distractions in the car. And all of those distractions just about come from one thing, from your smartphone. You can do anything on a smartphone. You can shop, you can look at social media, you can communicate with friends, you can listen to music. And a lot of people are under the delusion that they can use their smartphone while driving and be safe. And the truth is, you can only do one thing at a time while you're driving. You need to be driving. Otherwise, you're not being safe. Now, let me tell you about Frank. Frank was my friend. He was a really strong guy, even though he was in his 70s at the time that he passed. To give you an example, one day I drove up to the church where I preach, and Frank was out in the front raking grass. Now, that may not seem like all that big a deal until you realize that our lot is 8.5 acres. A lot of you would probably complain about being asked to rake leaves in your half-acre lot. Imagine raking grass over 8.5 acres. That's a lot of grass, but Frank was out there doing it, barely breaking a sweat. He was in his 70s, but he was a really strong guy. He liked to garden. He liked to do a lot of things outside. He cheated death, not one time, but twice. He had a bad gallbladder, and it took the doctors a while to discover it. And because of his infected gallbladder, he was septic. That means he had a blood infection, an infection throughout his whole body. And it nearly killed him, like I said, not once but twice. In fact, both times the doctors told him to call his family in and, get his affairs in order. And he and I planned out his funeral. But amazingly, he recovered from it. And we used to joke that nothing would ever get Frank, that Frank is the guy that cheated death. Frank was always this strong guy that everybody looked up to. He was always joking and laughing. He had a lot of friends. But one day, he and his wife were coming home from a doctor's appointment. And Frank got really sleepy. And he asked his wife if they could pull over and switch places so she could drive the rest of the way home while he rested in the passenger seat. And she agreed to do it. And they pulled over on the shoulder of the highway. Now, that's a very dangerous thing to do. You should never do it unless you just have no other options. And I guess Frank figured he didn't have any other options, that he really needed to pull over and rest. So they did. And as Frank was getting out of the driver's side of the vehicle and making his way around the front to switch places with his wife, a car came around the curve in the interstate at 70 miles an hour and struck Frank while he was standing on his feet by the highway and threw him off the road into the grass. They called an ambulance. The ambulance came and took him to UAB hospital, but he couldn't survive the injuries, and he died a few hours later. Now, this is really ironic because Frank used to say something to me whenever I was about to go on a trip. He would always say, "Look out for the other guy." And that's ironic because it's the other guy who killed Frank. And you're probably imagining some mean, grizzled, strong, robust, careless driver who killed Frank, but it's nothing like that. The guy who struck Frank with his vehicle was a young man, had his whole life in front of him. He was a religious man. He was a caring guy. He pulled over to see what he could do to help after he hit Frank, and actually asked Frank's wife if he could pray with her after the ambulance took off. He was crying his eyes out. And it's sad because there was nothing that he could do after the ambulance left but just get in his car and drive back home. The reason that he hit Frank was because he was texting while driving. He wasn't keeping his eyes on the road. That was all. He wasn't drunk. He was just texting. And because he was texting, he took a man's life. I wonder what he was texting about. What do you text about? Most of the time, it's not anything really all that important. Maybe a joke, or talking about a school assignment, or maybe making plans for the weekend, or discussing something that you did, or a problem that you're having with a friend or your parents or something. But it's usually something that can wait. Have you ever texted something that's worth a man's life? And yet, we keep texting while we're driving. In 2016, the year that Frank died, 3,450 fatalities occurred due to distracted driving. And one of those fatalities was my friend Frank. I don't feel bad for Frank anymore. He was a Christian. He was prepared. And he's in a much better place now. I'm sad for his wife. She doesn't get to spend the last years of her life with her husband that she loves. She has to live alone, but she has a support group and family that are there for her. She's making it. The one I feel worst about is that young man. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know where he is. But I'm sure that not a day goes by that he doesn't think about that fatal hour when he was texting instead of keeping his eyes on the road and took a man's life. I'm telling you this because you're young and you have very few, if any, regrets so far. That's a unique time in your life because as you get older, you are going to make some big mistakes that you will regret for the rest of your life. But most of those regrets, if not all of them, hopefully, are things that you go most days without ever thinking about. Just sometimes you'll think back and wish things were different, wish you had made different choices. But a few people make mistakes that are so bad, they get stuck in regret for the rest of their lives. Texting while driving is just asking for one of those regrets. And so the message is simple today. Keep your eyes on the road, stay focused, don't text while driving.